Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to a special episode with Tim Wilson. Tim is a Australian politician and a member of the Liberal Party of Australia. He is currently the Assistant Minister to the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction. I'd like to start with, how are you today, Tim?
Good, Sunil. Fantastic. It's beautiful weather here in Melbourne, in Australia. We're at, of course, that most beautiful time of year where the days are still relatively long and warm. The tragedy, of course, is that we're all stuck inside in offices doing work. But, I'd still rather be able to go home and have a nice glass of wine in the afternoon, the alternative.
Fantastic. I mean, there's lots of, sort of different questions we've had in from people to ask yourself. I suppose we can start with sort of early beginnings of your career. How did you get involved in politics and in particular with the Liberal Party of Australia?
So I kind of got involved with politics by accident. I was a teenager working in a reception centre, places where they do weddings and the like, and was washing glasses one night and was talking to this old guy, frankly, who was, was listening to my life story to the extent it was at the age of 18 about what I was interested in doing. And I was currently studying, or at the time studying, a Bachelor of Arts at university, or Fine Arts, sorry, majoring in painting, and was switching over to a Bachelor of Arts to kind of look more at politics and public policy. And he was saying, "Oh, my son's a member of Parliament. Would you like to go and do an internship with him?" So I did that, and that then led me off to join the Liberal Party at the age of 18. And then I've sort of been involved my entire really adult life. My values were liberal always because I believed in country essentially built from responsible citizens, families, and communities, and the role of the market economy. And of course, I put it in different categories, but simplistically, when it comes down to, I believe in economic prosperity, social inclusion, environmental stewardship, and a sense of national pride around making sure that we stand up for Australia and its values both here and overseas. And so all of those sort of broad fit into a package, and they very closely align with the Liberal Party. But I didn't run for Parliament for nearly 20 years after I first joined, and it was when I had the opportunity to represent the good people of Goldstein, which I now have the privilege of representing. And that was after doing lots of other things, because I've always taken the view that you've got to have a happy career despite politics, because, a lot of people may not get the opportunity to do it, and they still need to be able to look back at their life and think they've lived a life of meaning and purpose.
Would you say that's a bit of advice you'd have for sort of aspiring people in politics? We have quite a number of young sort of people on our platform. We tend to tune in. Would you say that's the sort of advice you'd give them?
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the first things when you first get elected to the House of Representatives in Australia is they explain to you how few people have actually had that privilege. And I can't remember the exact number, but in 2016, when I was first elected, it was about 1,400 people in essentially 116 years. So when you think about that and you think about how little people have had a chance to serve, spending your life, aspiring to be a member of Parliament, while it might come off and it may be all of your dreams, there are plenty of people who have tried and not been successful along the way. But there's another fundamental reason, which is, you're only as good in politics to the degree of your life experience. If you have no life experience, then you actually have little value in Parliament. And I think that's one of the big challenges for younger people, not because they're young, their youthful energy is welcome, but you actually learn and grow throughout your life. I was looking at running slightly earlier and chose not to. And I'm the first to say I am a much better, not just politician, but parliamentarian. My thinking is more mature. My approach is more considered in terms of public policy and how I approach it, even though I can still be a bit of a firebrand from time to time. And so I think, you're better off having that accumulated life experience, but you still want that energy. And so that's why it's good to have people who are young, but not too young sometimes.
It's interesting you say that because we had Sir Geoffrey Archer on our platform recently, and he said something very similar when he advises MPs or prospective MPs, he tends to say to them that they should have a career first, and they should ideally join at a slightly later stage in their life where they've had a bit of a career and they've had a bit of a journey in sort of working life. Um, I would be interested to sort of go back a bit towards yourself joining the Liberal Party as the sort of party that you decided to be a part of. And you mentioned there in terms of the reasons why. Do you think there's been a shift in the Liberal Party and when you joined maybe 20 years ago, so to now? And if so, what are some of the sort of changes you've seen?
I don't think there has been a shift in terms of values. I think the values have remained consistent. But, in politics, you don't get to decide the issues you confront. You only get to decide how to respond to them. And when I first got involved in politics, 20 years ago, we were coming out of the 90s recession. We were still in that period of kind of liberalism, which was focused on how do we get the state out of things to unleash the equity really that exists within the economy and society to free it up after the legacy of the post-war era. And the whole conversation has just shifted since then for lots of reasons. New issues have come up, economic circumstances have changed. This is all even before COVID. But even then, I think a lot of the issues that we need to confront politically have also changed. So, 20 years ago, yes, there was obviously discussion around climate change and the environment, but that has really gone from a lower tier issue to really one of the most pronounced ones, and now is increasingly so intrinsically intertwined to the economic conversation, the future direction of their country, and the country and the world. So I think fluency and proficiency in that space matters so much, but I don't think there's been a values alignment. In fact, I think where the climate change conversation has gone is from really what's been an extreme left kind of Malthusian approach to public policy to a much more, in Australia we say liberal one, but much more focused on, well, how do we grow the economy? What's the role of technology? And how do we actually work with the slipstream of it to actually improve our economic development and our economic strength? I think one of the other big issues that shifted dramatically that hasn't really been on the conversation piece in Australia in the past has been around intergenerational equity. And I wrote a book about that. Actually, now it's scary. It's now getting up to nearly 2 years ago, which shows you how much time passes when the pandemic was on. But around the importance of home ownership and what we need to be doing to get young Australians into their own home and to be able to realise their ambition. Because if people can't see their lives live through the values that you project, then or your political movement projects, then why would they subscribe to them? And increasingly the concern that young people feel like the system is rigged against them. And one of the books I actually read before writing mine was actually one by a Tory, or I think a former Tory MP, a fellow by the name of David Willits. And he wrote a book called The Pinch, which is how baby boomers stole their children's future and should give it back or something. Mine wasn't that provocative, but the principles remain the same. So I think the issues have changed, and I think that's why that constant tension between life experience and energy matters, because one of the challenges I think for a lot of politicians is how do they constantly reinvent not just themselves for the sake of branding, but how do they reassess and reinvent the issues they're focusing on so they're always connecting with the full spectrum of society? Because I have a deep concern about some of the what I would say is actually entrenched conservative interests that are emerging in Australian society, where we have an older generation who have done very well, and good luck to them. But it's our tax and transfer system is increasingly favouring them at the expense of younger Australians. And I want to have a much bigger conversation because I think it leads to a more liberal society. And I think that's fundamentally where I sit. In Australia, we don't normally use the C word, though it's normally used a bit more commonly. Not Commonwealth, that's fine, conservative. It's becoming more common because really, to me, liberalism is about the democratization of a society, creating one where people have a greater sense of ownership, participation in all forms, social, economic, political, and that we want to keep that and make sure we don't establish vested interests that can ultimately undermine it.
There's a lot to unpack in what you said there. I think we can start with your book, The New Social Contract. And
Yep.
that would be, I think, a great place to dig deeper. Fantastic. That is available on Amazon, right? Just for some of our sort of UK.
Yeah, it is.
That's probably the where they'd probably look to purchase
The
the
New
book.
Social Contract, Renewing the Liberal Vision for Australia, at all good online bookstores.
Fantastic. I mean, a lot of stuff you've mentioned that are very reminiscent and are very similar to issues we have here in the UK. And especially when it comes to housing, it's something that's discussed a lot in terms of the younger generation struggling to get on the housing ladder. For our listeners who haven't read the book, is that something that's mentioned in the book? Then, do you have sort of ideas on how you would change that and how you would make it easier for sort of if you like the younger generation to get on the property ladder?
Well, yeah, there's many ideas in the book, but the book is really written as a foundational book because I think there's this challenge when we get into the linguistics of politics in Australia, where people use the word liberal to what you guys would broadly mean as sort of centre-right disposition. And one of the things I was trying to enunciate in the book is that Australian liberalism is quite a different flavour to how the word liberal these days is used in many other places. Obviously, America, it's been completely hijacked by the progressive left. And obviously in the UK, through the merger with the Social Democrats, the concept of liberalism, at least in the brand, has been, let's say, sullied in part in the UK. Whereas the point I was trying to make in the book, and we'll get to the housing piece, don't worry, I'm answering your question, is that Australian liberalism is really about how do we have an open society and how do we keep a democratic society, because the enemies of liberalism is essentially concentrations of power, economic, social, and political power. And we want a pluralist society, one that's competitive in every sense, and we don't, of course, want to reward entrenched interests. And of course, this goes to the heart of what is ultimately the Australian project post-European settlement. Back when European settlement arrived on this island continent, obviously at the expense of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, there was kind of this view that it was a blank slate and they could start up everything fresh. Now, that had other consequences, as I said, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, but politically it was very much about how do we create a society that's absent the hereditary privilege that existed principally in the United Kingdom at the time. And one of the ways they did that was to say no hereditary title for land, as sort of large estates and acreages, that if you had land, you had to use it, so you couldn't just have it for no purpose, and to award it on the basis that it was kind of like a point of permission in society. And what Australia's always had is a very high level of home ownership as a consequence. And that's breaking down. And there's a lot of reasons that underpin that. Some of it's political, some of it's economic, but a lot of it goes to things like how we tax assets in our society. The family home is exempt from tax. There's favourable treatment depending on how different assets are treated, particularly in comparison to capital growth from homeowner or from owning a home versus taxes paid from labour. We also have this huge structural imbalance with our pension system. In Australia, we have a compulsory private pension system. So you take 10% of your wage, it goes into an account. But of course, at the age of 18, your first priority is to buy your own home. And the biggest barrier to buying your own home is to save a deposit. So that 10, 20%, depending on how you want to structure it. And people, when they have the smallest income, take the largest chunk of their disposable income and throw it to their 65th birthday when they really need it, probably for their 21st. And so what we've seen year on year is the average age of home ownership go out. And so I've been running this campaign called Home First, Super Second, which is saying, let's get the priorities right. It makes more sense for people to buy their own home young and then for them to start saving for their retirement, because we know the biggest leading indicator of poverty in retirement is whether you own your own home or not. But one of the other big issues we have is supply. In Australia, local government and state government restrictions have essentially meant that we've completely constrained new housing in the country while we've continued to pump in more and more people. So, of course, supply, demand, everybody knows what happens. And in some cases, it's been found to account for up to a third of the cost of a new property development from planning and zoning regulation. So that's a big deal. And of course, we've all seen over the past 2 years how much monetary policy can play its role. And with lax monetary policy, we've just seen house prices continue to spiral.
Are house prices continuing to rise quite steeply in Australia at the moment? Because in the UK, again, a lot of the stuff that you've said is very, very similar, and I'm sure a lot of our UK audience can definitely relate. So, are household prices in Australia just continuously rising?
Well, they've risen strongly over the past 2 years. They've stabilised a bit in more recent times, or slowed. The growth is probably better, and we're expecting them probably to go down over the next kind of 12 months to 2 years, particularly as interest rates rise as a result of tightening of monetary policy. But, let's not kid ourselves. We've seen exponential growth in places. I mean, Australia has an abundance of land. You can just look at a map and you can tell that. Our capital cities, while well populated, are not so overpopulated that it justifies having average prices of over $1 million. And so we've got to be realists. And what we've also seen, as I imagine you have in the UK as well, is because of COVID, people have realised, well, actually, I can't really live in a one-bedroom apartment if I have to live and work from home. Or I need a balcony or outdoor space. If you've got kids, the option of just squeezing one last kid into the second bedroom with the other one just doesn't cut anymore. And we've also had a lot of retirees who have sped up stages of their life. They might have lived in a city, thought in the next 5-10 years they'll move to the country, and now that they can work remotely, they've made conscious decisions to pick up and go, but that's then led to house price increases in regional centres. So it's got dynamic effects, and some of them are good. The improvement in the increased number of people moving to regional areas is great because we're too highly centralised a population, to be truthful. And what we've discovered, obviously, through the use of technology like the one we're on now, is you don't need to be in the city the whole time. In fact, it kind of feels like we're going back to everything old is new again, where you live in the country, you come into town for a couple of days, you might stay at the club or something like that, or have some sort of share arrangement, and otherwise you can work from rural or regional areas. And so there's an adjustment going on, and some of it's good, but the trade-off is that house prices in many parts of Australia have gone up and really made first home ownership what was already immensely challenging. And we haven't even talked about government incentives, which just only act to increase the amount of cost of a house overall for everybody, the problems that they bring too.
I think that's a really interesting comment, and it's again, our audience will definitely relate. We've seen a massive increase in prices in areas just outside of London, so areas where there's a bit more sort of greenery, a bit like where I live in Maidenhead, those sort of areas just outside of London where quite a lot of greenery and people no longer needing to live in London anymore, so preferring to sort of live just outside it where they can still come into London, but have the benefit of living in a slightly bigger house as opposed to right in sort of central London.
But now they also need the city, and they also need the other allied things that come with that too.
Exactly that, and I think that's been a massive sort of change that we've seen in the past 2 years. I think talking of the last 2 years, it'd be very interesting to see how it's been in Australia, what it's been like. I mean, in the UK, we are, as of Thursday, going to be ending all sort of COVID restrictions. So we'll be sort of returning back to normality, if we can say that. What's it been like?
Normalcy, yeah.
Yeah, what's it been like in Australia for the past 2 years?
Well, of course, it's varied. We're a federation, so we have different rules depending on the states that we're in. My state was probably hit hardest, Victoria, where we had technically, I think it was the world's longest time in lockdown, which is not an experience anyone would want to repeat. So it's been immensely challenging for everybody. But we've got Western Australia, which is obviously the state to the western part of the country, has never really confronted COVID. They've basically been able to keep it out, as we were able to at different points as a nation for a long period of time, because we have the luxury of closing the international border. People can debate whether the right decisions were made at different times, but in practice, people were confronted with, particularly during those lockdown months, immensely challenging situation, because it was something that, I'm sure you're in exactly the same situation. I would never even have thought was something I would engage with in my adult life. The idea of being stuck at home. Fortunately, I've got a modest home, but nonetheless one with a little garden and everything else, which I truthfully never really appreciated until that was your total circumference of your globe. Obviously some people who did it not just in terms of their housing environment tough, but work from home, were educating their children from home, and in many cases also quite economically insecure. And so you have, it really frankly entrenched a lot of, if people were well off, they went through it comfortably. But of course, the pain was felt by a lot of people in lower income distributions, and who really didn't have much of a voice, because for the most part in Australia, it was, the sort of traditional Labor working class favoured governments that were doing most of the harshest lockdowns.
I see. And what was the sort of take on people on lockdowns? Because in the UK, it's been the response has been quite mixed. I think some of our I'd probably say most of the population towards the end. So as lockdowns were coming towards an end, we're generally, I think that the mood has sort of changed. People became more receptive to them. Some people were calling for sort of almost like regular winter lockdown. So that there was, there definitely seems to have been a change in the UK. Our almost biggest opposition to lockdown often became from inside Tories, so almost Conservative MPs arguing with each other, as opposed to should we keep lockdowns going, or should we end them earlier. That seemed to be quite a regular battle that was going on quite publicly. Has that been similar in Australia? Has there been quite a mixed response, or has everyone generally largely been on the same sort of page when it comes to lockdowns?
It's varied considerably. So, as I said, in the first lockdown we had, which was, technically the first one I think was in April 2020, everybody got it. Like even I said, yep, this makes sense. It was only for about 2 weeks, I think, but it was, COVID was new. Nobody knew what was going on. Everybody was frankly a bit terrified, and there was a rational basis for the lockdown, which was, basically we're shutting the country down for 2 weeks so that the health system can do whatever it needs to do, and we just can't have other people doing things that would stuff that up. Now, whether or not that was rational in hindsight, it had a logic and a purpose to it. But then we had these, I think we've had 6 lockdowns now in different stages in Victoria, and each one it became harder to justify and harder to rationalise. And so first one, everybody was on board, everyone was chill. Second one, that went for months and months and months, people really found taxing by the end. But then when you got into the third and the fourth ones, it just started to not make any sense, and we weren't really sure what it was we were achieving, and particularly because they were completely non-geospecific outside of our state boundaries. You had a situation where there were no cases hundreds of miles away or kilometres away, and there were no cases, but those people were in lockdown just like we were, where there might have been many cases. Every time you had to jump over a state border, you had to do 2 weeks of quarantine, even though you had no symptoms, etc. It was kind of crazy, to be honest. So once we had a whole second year of lockdowns, I think overwhelmingly the response has been, no more, we're not going to put up with this. And really governments, I think, tested their social license. But the appetite has been varied depending on where you are in the country. Again, one of the issues in the Victorian lockdown is we actually defeated the alpha wave of COVID in 2020. We literally went to hundreds of cases a day. I think it peaked about 700, and we got it down to 0. So we actually defeated the virus, which when you think about it is actually kind of insane on one level, but also kind of cool on another level. But the flip side is once Delta came along, they tried the same approach and didn't assess the reality that, COVID wasn't as easily suppressed. And so they kept trying the same strategy, even though the circumstances were different and it's clear you weren't going to be able to stop it. But it gave everybody a false confidence. We've done this, we can beat it, and we can beat Delta as well. And in fact, in practice, transmissibility showed you couldn't. So that was kind of a learning journey, but that's why everybody's now over it, because they realize that it's not a viable option. But as I said, it plays out different parts of the country. Some people have done it immensely tough, particularly, as I said before, low-income people. There are a lot of people who went into lockdown comfortable, went through lockdown comfortable. In fact, they might have even done some home repairs and upgrades to make sure it was even more comfortable, and then came out of it comfortable, if not ahead. There are a lot of people who went into lockdown as well, uncomfortable or struggling, got smashed by lockdowns, and then have come out essentially having to start their life, particularly small business owners. So you talk to them about lockdowns and they'll completely lose their nut about
it. Again, lots to sort of unpack on COVID and the impact it's made. What's the current situation like in Australia at the moment in terms of COVID restrictions? Is it different again state to state?
It's different again state to state, but everybody's broadly moving to let's move on. There's no real justification for a lot of these measures anymore. We've reopened our international border. Now, people have been coming and going, but it's been more restricted and only changed yesterday. So most of the states now, you can go back. In fact, my state on Friday, we introduced that you can go back into the office with no masks or anything like that. Because, the thing that shocked all of us has been our vaccination rate. I remember when we were talking about vaccines, firstly, excited that there even was one, but that, if we were lucky, we maybe get to 60 or 70%. I can't remember what the official number is, but it's about 95%, which is extraordinary when you think about it. Boosters are lagging a bit, but basically headed in the same trajectory. We assume I thought 60 or 70% will be lucky to get that. And maybe if we, really pushed it over a long period, we get up to 80%. And they just went like that. It just happened. Bang. Amazing. People got vaccinated. And literally the only slowness to get jabs in people's arms was the capacity to be able to supply the vaccines and physically get it into people's arms, which is extraordinary. So there's really no reason to not go back to a normalcy. The big question, of course, is what happens if there's another wave of this virus, or of course another one, but you take as it comes. But you look at Western Australia, they basically kept the virus out throughout the entire pandemic, and they're starting not the vaccine part, but the engagement with the virus for the first time in 2 years. It's quite extraordinary. It's like they're on a 2 year behind the times, but they've been able to carry on normal for 2 years.
It doesn't sound quite as. It sounds probably a bit more extreme than some things that are going on in New Zealand. We do a lot of work with the New Zealand National Party on this platform, and they've often for the last 2 years been sort of saying how they've just not done enough work on getting people vaccinated, and they kind of shut themselves off from the rest of the world, but didn't necessarily think about the reopening, or kind of they took the head start in some ways, but then sort of lagged behind. Is that similar for Western Australia in some ways, or it's just they didn't really have to deal with the virus generally at the start?
Well, they just had this luxury. I mean, Perth, the capital city of Western Australia, is the most geographically isolated capital city on earth. Basically in every direction you go, there's nothing for a very, very long way. And so they can effectively close their border, as Australia could at the start of the pandemic, to the rest of the world. And if you stop people moving into the location, you keep the virus out. Now, in the meantime, they have got people vaccinated. They've had mini outbreaks, but not serious ones. And so they've had this luxury of time, which nobody else has had. And so with their vaccination rate where they've now had an outbreak, it's likely to go through the community like it has everywhere else. And so I think that time has ended. But they've done it essentially with as much armory as one can have in the circumstances for a population, because that's all vaccines are, whereas we got it without the armory.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. It's always interesting to hear what's going on in sort of different countries in relation to COVID. I mean, one of the big discussion points in the UK, I think everyone sort of was on a similar page on the first lockdown, not knowing what it was, and everyone kind of agreed that we should almost have the lockdown, and it became a question of how we should open up and what that would look like in terms of the new world. And that kind of question, I suppose, I'd have for yourself is, what is that new world looking like for Australia at the moment? So in the UK, we're seeing some definite changes in terms of industry, definite changes in terms of some good things, if you like, from the virus, some things that we've learned, some not so good things that have happened from the virus. What are some of the sort of key takeaways for Australia, if you like, in terms of what's maybe it's industries that have changed, or maybe there's an improvement in some areas. What would you say are some of the key kind of takeaways from if you like from February 2020 to now?
Well, the truth is, I think it's too early to tell. I know that's the old trotted out line about the French Revolution, but I actually do think it is, because everybody's going back to this kind of new normal, and nobody quite knows how much it is the new normal. Not because of another wave of the virus, that obviously would potentially throw a spanner in the works, but because we're seeing a lot of people who are, not wanting to return to work. As I said, people who used to live, say, an hour's drive or further out of a capital city, now saying that they don't want to return to an office if they can get away with it. There has been a rapid change in Australian industry. I think Australian industry has done really well through this period, not just because they've put in place the measures to keep operating, but particularly in the early days around adaptivity, around creating ventilators and the like. We realised we actually have a lot more domestic capacity probably than we were fully aware of. But I also don't think you can separate it out from broader trends. While COVID has been happening, we've had the exacerbation of some pretty substantial changes around regional supply chains, particularly due to the behaviour of some of our friends to our north in China, and that's leading to all sorts of changes that were happening irrespective of COVID, but COVID has brought it to the fore and probably amplified it and sped them up. So I think we're in a dynamic period, and frankly, I think we're in one of the most dangerous times, challenging times for Australia, I think, and probably it's one of the most challenging decades, well, certainly in my adult lifetime, because there are so many things all compounding at the moment. Serious, economic risks around financial stability, which have emerged particularly as a consequence of COVID response measures. Obviously, regional political instability as a result of the role of China in the region and particularly the Pacific. Climate risk, which has traditionally not been something we've had to factor in. As a general rule, national security risk in response to some of those earlier factors that business hasn't traditionally had to factor in. You just look at, I call it the stack, but health risk obviously associated with pandemic, supply chain risk, something frankly we've never really dealt with before. And you kind of look at the stack and you go, there's so much that business and industry is going to have to adapt to and price in, where they either haven't had to price in for a long time, like national security risk, and even then, frankly, it was marginal. And of course, or are now not just factoring in, but it's critical to major investment systems. I mean, energy risk, as Europe is experiencing at the moment. Now, while we've been an energy superpower off the back of both conversations about climate risk, but also around international instability in energy markets, as well as the drive around where capital is flowing, you've just got all these dynamic factors that are playing out, which and all at once, and often in cases we haven't traditionally had to deal with it, which just makes for a very fluid environment.
I think one of those topics you mentioned there that's talked about a lot in the UK, and there definitely seems to be a changing in our relationship with them, is China. I think there's no doubt that I think there has been changes in terms of the UK government's approach with them. And I think we've had lots of different Conservative MPs on our platform. I think the best analogy I think we've had from someone is about diversifying their portfolio. Working finance, the better it makes sense to have more of a diverse portfolio. What's the general consensus in Australia with regards to China? Because I know it's obviously your largest trading partner. There is they have a play a significant role in Australia, like they do in the UK. Has there been a sort of growing sentiment to almost not necessarily move away from China, but become less reliant on them?
Well, yes, but firstly, I think there was a shift in tone already. There was, even pre-COVID, there was an awareness that there needed to be more diversification away from just everybody relying on all things, heading through Shanghai and Guangzhou. But it's absolutely exacerbating, particularly because we've taken a very firm view as a government on China, and they've taken punitive measures in response. I mean, there's no point kidding ourselves, particularly on certain product lines that we've had to diversify. And in fact, what I think, and frankly, I won't say it's a good thing, but I will say that it's prompted business in many ways to stop being lazy. A lot of them have seen the opportunity in China. They've done very well out of it. They've made a lot of money, like a lot of money. But they've also realized that obviously, like any hedging of risk, it barely is factored into their decision making when they're just sending everything to one destination. It's forced them to go, okay, how do we broaden our markets? How do we regionalize? How do we take advantage of new growing markets as well? Obviously, a country like India being one, but also even looking at South American nations and the role that they can play, of course, as well as other ones in the ASEAN countries. So I think diversification was going to be like most things. COVID sped the future up and brought a whole bunch of things forward, and I think that's what in practice has occurred. And I think we found that we can obviously still sell things to China, but you can't put all eggs in one basket. And you can also hedge your risk more effectively by making sure that they have broader options and we have broader options, because we're seeing the rise in the investment they're making in places like Democratic Republic of Congo, particularly in things like critical minerals, the next big potential kind of commodities boom, which we will be at the fore of. But again, I go back to that stack, closely is intertwined with national security risk and how to mitigate that. And obviously the renewable transformation, or just, the building of Australia's future industrial economy is going to be dependent on extracting value from our critical minerals because of the role they're going to play in not just things like solar PV cells, but battery technology and the like. So, I think it's a challenging time, but to properly understand where the economy is heading, you've got to include that stack of risk, and you start to realize that we can't do everything ourselves, but at the same time, we're not going to be able to rely on the confidence of open international trading routes in the way that have existed when I studied trade policy, nearly 20 years ago at university.
So, we've seen, Scott Morrison and generally the Australians, if you like the tone with China's been really well applauded by a lot of people in this country. It seems like you've taken quite a tougher stance than maybe New Zealand just across the border. The comparisons, I think that Australia's response has been really well received. Is that general sort of consensus in Australia with the people as well? Is it that shift, if you like, not necessarily away from China, but that kind of diversifying like portfolios and looking at different countries? You mentioned India there and some of South America. That's an interesting point about South America, because that's not really something that's really mentioned much in this country. We tend to look at India, Malaysia, those sort of countries near kind of China. So it's interesting that you mentioned South America. Does Australia and South America have a relatively decent relationship at the moment?
Well, there's a number of questions you've asked there. So Australia's relationship in South America is modest, I think it'd be fair to say. And some of that's because we've traditionally been competitors. Obviously, even though we have good relations with other countries a long way away, where we may be divided by even more than bodies of water, we've had no traditional reason to deeply engage with South America. But there have been some Australian businesses that have, particularly those for instance, in the mining sector, big investments in things like copper in places like Chile and the like. So there's definitely been some relationship. It's just not as deep as it has been elsewhere. But there has been a bit of a shift. I mean, over the period from, I don't know where you want to count it, about in the mid-90s or maybe early 90s through till about the mid-2010s, we all broadly signed up to the international ideal that countries are going to work cooperatively together to promote peace and prosperity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's become obvious that some nations have political or national and sovereign interests that extend beyond international peace and prosperity for all. And increasingly, as we're seeing very, very pragmatically, for the Chinese government, their view is that they have a pact with their citizens, which is prosperity for compliance. And that's been one they've traditionally had with their domestic population. They now want it with other countries, prosperity for compliance. And that's obviously not a deal that we can sign up to. We can have prosperity with civility, but we can't have it with compliance. And it was only a matter of time before they ran into a country that was prepared to do a similar deal as Australia was, prosperity for civility. And we just happened to be probably the first naked one on the strip. And so we've hit it kind of a bit head first. But the reality is there are a lot of other things that are underpinning the policy shift around cybersecurity issues, obviously national defence and security issues, but also, again, issues of regionalisation and trade diversion, or trade interest, which have led it to become a more challenging relationship than it has in the past. But, Australia's interest is to stand up for itself. China's interest is to stand up for itself. And we want other countries to be able to stand up on their own 2 feet. But we just don't believe in the end that another nation should be compliant to another nation. We want a concert of nations all around the world who feel proud and confident of their own history, their traditions, and their future. And we want them to succeed as much as we do. Whether other countries perhaps can say the same thing versus having all roads and all resources being serviced for one nation is a different matter.
And that leads quite nicely to the sort of final question I have and final sort of topic, which is on the Commonwealth. We often look at China in some ways as a bit of an opportunity for the Commonwealth as Commonwealth nations to work closer together and have the opportunity to build sort of closer ties with our shared history. Is that something that's you also would believe in and agree with? And is that something that Australia has an appetite for as well?
Yeah, I think a lot of Australians probably look at the Commonwealth truthfully as a bit of a moribund sort of institution in terms of where we are, and that's not said with any sense of derision. It's just that we're now. Once upon a time, we were obviously treated as an offshoot of the United Kingdom, and that hasn't been present in terms of our thinking for a long period of time. But now we see ourselves very much, even if we're not of traditional Asian heritage, very much in this region, and we are in the contested region of the world, although Vladimir Putin is obviously trying to do as much to prove that theory wrong as possible. But really, this is going to be the Pacific century. Everybody can see that. And so we see ourselves very much part of this sphere and this part of the world. And so the Commonwealth obviously plays a role because it does bring together countries in this region, including many islands, and provides us with a gateway. But is it the central way we probably see the world? Probably not. But what's also become clear to all of us, as we've recognised as kind of whatever we want to call it, the bifurcation of the world or deglobalization, I think that's still probably too strong a word, but a shift away from the kind of liberal internationalism that dominated the world from 1930 to sort of the mid-10s, which would have made Francis Fukuyama proud, is kind of at an end. And what are we realising? That values clearly do matter. Our principles that anchor not just our institutions, but our democratic way of life and open market economies and trading nations, they matter. And they have as equal relevance as the dollar that it brings us. And so we just have to weigh up these competing considerations. It's, we're going into an era where big state politics is back. It's not just about service delivery and how a nation can provide support and assistance to its citizens. And we've truthfully become a bit introspective as nations, thinking our job is to take care of ourselves into an environment which is contested, and we need friends, and because other countries will have friends too, and that we're going to need to act probably not necessarily as a bloc, but certainly in ways that we can work constructively together to achieve international aims. And that sometimes it's easy to do that with countries with similar institutions, similar value alignment, and similar aspirations to the world. And of course, the Commonwealth, as much as anything else, brings countries together because of that heritage, but also because of that value alignment, and because the Commonwealth doesn't seek to dominate other nations. It merely wants countries to be able to succeed and bring together countries to be able to cherish the inheritance they have, but as part of a pathway for future success. So
I think that's a perfect way to end today's conversation. It's been great having you on, Tim, today on our platform, and hopefully we can get you on soon again. I think it'd be great to discuss your book in further detail, and we can try and arrange something there. And for us,
well, I'm coming to the UK hopefully in June, so I can see you there as well.
Oh, fantastic. That'd be great. Yeah, definitely do reach out to us. To our audience, we have a number of more episodes coming out in the coming weeks. We obviously have a return to physical events in the House of Commons in March. But yeah, thank you for tuning in today, and thank you for your time, Tim.
Thanks so much, Neil. You take care, and to all your listeners.